So look, welcome to this week's episode of Leaders on a Mission, where I'm joined by inspiring leaders driven by the impact of creating a healthy and sustainable world. Now, in today's episode, I'm joined by Matt Lipscomb, founder and CEO of DMC Bio. They're a mission-driven company, really using the power of biology to create this paradigm shift in the chemicals marketplace with the production of sustainable and bio-based chemicals. And Matt, listen, I appreciate your time. Thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you. Nice to be here, and thanks for having me.
Pleasure. Tell me, where did it all start with you? I'm thinking, just like some of the early things, and maybe the early upbringing and some of the key forces that helped shape who you are today, really. Sure.
I can give you a couple of very concrete examples that kind of set me on my professional path.
Yeah.
So I'm a chemical engineer by training, and my undergraduate education was very classical chemical engineering, right? So a lot of thermochemical, petroleum-based processing, things like that. The school I went to Clemson University, great school. Had a very strong cooperative education program. So it meant I got to go to work for a chemical company, right? And I would say that the experience I had at that particular chemical company was eye-opening in terms of how the chemical industry world works. And I'm not going to name names, but I can tell you that there were days when I was fearful for my life in terms of the processing environment. And I kind of came to realize that maybe this is not where I want to be spending the rest of my time. As cool as the chemistry and engineering was, and still is, I decided to go a different direction. So I went to grad school and got a PhD in chemical engineering and switched into more of biotechnology, worked in pharmaceutical biotech. And I would say sort of the next seminal moment, the next major learning for me personally, this was sort of early 2000s. This is sort of the time of monoclonal antibodies. And again, as fascinating as the science was, I think what I came to realize was that for my role as a chemical engineer and where I could really contribute in the biopharmaceutical space, it really wasn't that impactful, right? So the impactful things were happening either ahead of or downstream of me, right? So it was either the scientists who were doing the bench scale discovery of what type of new targets or antagonists, they might serve as clinical targets, or it was happening by the clinicians, right? The doctors who were actually testing it. And it actually became the scientific challenge or engineering challenges of making it became so standardized at that point that several of the major pharmaceutical companies actually came out and put a white paper together that said, this is how you make these. It's like, well, that's my whole job in a white paper. That's not very interesting. So that's kind of what led me to go into industrial biotech, where I think there's an enormous untapped potential to use biotechnology to make chemicals, where economics matter, and in a way that's both economically attractive and also much more sustainable than how we make things today.
Great, absolutely. Tell me, do you still refer to it as industrial biotech? Because it's interesting with names, SynBio, industrial biotech, and clean tech. How do you refer to the classification of what you do?
That's a very good question. And you're right, there's a lot of jargon floating around. Perhaps I'm either antiquated or just holding on, but I actually prefer metabolic engineering. Yeah. Because to me, that's really what it is, right? How do you engineer an entire set of biochemical reactions in the context of a microbe and get them to do what you want? But you're right. I think the current term people often use now is precision fermentation or synthetic biology or SynBio or industrial biotech. I think at this point it's kind of whatever makes sense to the audience.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So look, before we go into the your current role as a founder and CEO, I'm interested in if you distill all the kind of working experience you had before that, maybe just outline a couple of key moments or a couple of roles that you did that really set you up well for what you wanted to then go into.
Sure. I think certainly the most relevant was the experience at OPX Biotechnologies. So this was a company that spun out of the University of Colorado. One of the founders is my co-founder at DMC. So it was his postdoctoral work. And this was sort of 2007 timeframe. And it was a fascinating experience in many levels. So I was the first employee. There were four of us, four walls and a card table, right? And $1 million check from the first investment. And this was sort of the first round of clean tech or industrial biotech towards chemicals and fuels. And the whole experience was, I grew and learned so much over the course of that. Saw the full ride from, four of us, four walls and a card table, all the way up to the acquisition, ultimately by Cargill. I think we learned a lot of hard lessons, at that. We thought at the time we were doing better because we had concerns around making biofuels from biomass, just in terms of, it turns out that's a really hard cost point to hit, competing with fuel, right? So we were going after chemicals, so we thought that gave us a leg up, but at the time it was primarily a commodity chemical, which it turns out are still really challenging. So I think we were ahead in some ways, and I think we were kind of right in the mix of everyone else, right? Some hard lessons to learn. Yeah. And I think, some of the key takeaways, or one way I like to refer to them as sort of the original mistakes, if you will, right? Things that inspired us to do better. We live day in, day out, how hard it was to get to scale, right? So we had a great team doing really good work. They would create new strains, they would solve problems. The initial screen would work really, really well, and then you try to take them to a larger scale, even within the context of the lab, and it was just a disaster. And this was a problem that the field continues to face, even today in many ways. So I think that experience is really what inspired us and inspired my co-founder, Mike, when he left. He wound up as a professor at Duke, and that served as the inspiration for the technology that underlies DMC, right? It's how do you address this challenge of getting the microbe to ultimately do what we want it to do, which is make products at a set of metrics at a price that customers will buy, right? So
interesting. So you've really had to go through that journey, and 2007, it must have been a very challenging time, right? And I've heard for years about the valley of death and about scale up and challenge. So just tell me a little bit more then around, what does the technology do differently then, in order that you don't have the same challenges when it comes to scale up?
Sure. So if at a very high level, if you remember one thing from the conversation, I would say I can summarize it as, this is really the only technology that was truly made to scale. So when we set out, to prove this point, we started with the end in mind, right? We said, look, if you look at a commercial scale fermentation, which is very, very large, right? Tanks that are up to 600 cubic meters, right? So things that are multiple stories tall and, multiple meters in diameter, right? What does that need to look like to make a commercial product, right? And so we had this whole set of design criteria, if you will. And some of those are sort of engineering and operations, right? They all ultimately go back to the cost. But then we also said, well, what does the strain design need to look like to make this possible, right? And so what we figured out was, look, there was no standardization in the world of fermentation. So every time you made a new bug or a new pathway, you kind of had to do this endless cycle of, well, how do you run it in a tank? And that just adds up, cost and money and time. Because
it's biology, right? Because it's biology. Yeah,
right. Exactly. So what we did, we standardized that, right? So now we have one process. It doesn't matter what the product is. It doesn't matter what the scale is. It's always the same. Right. It's lessons learned in other industries, decades ago. Right. So standardization was a big piece of it. And then we also recognize that, okay, well, biology is responsive to the environment, right? That's how things survive, right? They adapt, right? But that's actually not what you want in the case of an industrial bioprocess. You want it to be the same, right? So we said, okay, well, how do we create a system that doesn't change genetically during the course of time that we're interested in? And how do we essentially limit the way the cell or the microbe can respond to that environment? And so that's another feature that we've engineered, right? So in a traditional system, a microbe may be able to withstand or may be able to thrive within a very narrow band of, say, temperature or pH or oxygen or something, right? And so what we've been able to do is make those bands much, much broader, right? Don't get me wrong, you can still break the system, and we've broken it a few times, but it's important to understand where those boundaries are, right? And our boundaries are much wider than a classical system. So that helps you, get to what we refer to as robustness. So robustness to the relevant environment. And then sort of the final element that those two things give you, so robustness really leads to predictability. So the challenge has always been, you take a strain from the lab, you take it to the next larger scale, and it does something totally different. So you have to go and then do a cycle of process development, understand why it's behaving differently, and then figure out how to run it so it runs the same. So what we've done is actually that predictability, that robustness leads to the exact same performance from a very small high throughput scale all the way up to now we've demonstrated to full commercial, so 85,000 liters and beyond. And so and we've done that for different products and pathways. And so it truly is a platform approach. I think that's one of the things that really differentiates our technology and the problem that we've solved compared to others in the space. So many others have focused on, well, we can engineer a cell really fast, or we can make lots of mutations or whatnot. But our technology really looks at it from a systems-based approach. So we say, look, if you need to make something industrially at scale, you obviously need a strain, but you need to understand all these other pieces, and all those pieces need to work together. They need to work together well. And so our technology harmonizes all the parts of the system such that they all work together well, and they eliminate, in particular, the cost and the timeline to get to scale, which, it can run to years and hundreds of millions of dollars historically. So
sounds very exciting. And I know, in my excitement about the technology, we jumped ahead very quickly into that. But just bringing it back around DMC, tell us a little bit about, the mission and the vision for the company and the problems you're solving.
Sure. So as you kind of already hinted at earlier in the conversation, we're aiming at disrupting how everyday chemicals are made. And as a chemical engineer, I lump everything into chemistry. So the marketing people and the food people don't like that, but that's who I am. So when you think about things like xylitol, to me, that's a chemical. Yes, it's a food, it's a sweetener, it's these other things, but it's a chemical, right? And chemicals touch every aspect of our life, right? From the food that we eat to the materials that we wear to the automobiles that we drive, right? It's just, it's ubiquitous, it's everywhere. And if you think about the last 170 years of the petrochemical industry, they've had a very long head start, right? Which is great. That's the state of the world that we've lived in for quite some time. But now, as we see the world changing with the greater, emphasis on sustainability, and you're starting to see commitment from both governments, right? So, for example, the IRA Act passed in the U.S. and the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism recently passed in Europe. And you're starting to see leadership from corporates as well, right? You're seeing commitments to net zero, and more importantly, it's not just words, right? They're putting real capital dollars at play to make real change. And so I think we can be a part of that solution. Industrial biotech, so changing how the world of chemicals, everything from monomers to foods to ingredients and everything in between, can be a big part of that. The goal to get to net zero is audacious. There is absolutely no doubt. And so every little piece of that matters. And I think the world of chemicals is something, at least within the mainstream media, that has, it's received a little bit less attention. So, when people think about decarbonizing, the first things that come up are, steel, right? And cement, and for good reason, right? Those are huge sources of greenhouse gas emissions. They're very high volume, and they're going to have to be addressed, but everything else will too. So I think as one piece of a very large puzzle that we all need to solve, I think that's where we can play an effective role.
Great. No, absolutely. And just your connection with that mission, is that something, because you mentioned earlier you joined the dangers of that first job that you spoke about, right? When you were, working there. Well, the connection with, I suppose, sustainability and, looking at these new feedstocks, as it were, and paradigm shift in the marketplace. This is very much the heart of the company, right? So where does that come from with you guys?
Well, I think for me personally, I can tell you, it comes from my direct experiences out in the wild. So I'm also a certified mountain guide. So I guide people in the mountains. I've spent a lot of time climbing and skiing mountains all over the world. And it's one thing to sort of hear about, climate change and, glaciers melting, and it's a whole other thing to actually go and see it in real life. And I think those are the things that really drove it home for me. So actually going on some of these glaciers in Alaska, in Canada, in Europe. And I think that the best example that I can give is going to a hut in the mountains in Switzerland. The site is at the original site of the hut that's 120 years old, right? But in that time, the glacier has receded so far. So 100 years ago, you could ski up, take off your skis, walk 100 yards and enjoy your beer on the patio, right? Today, they've had to install, 150 meters, vertical meters of stairs, metal stairs bolted into the side of a cliff to get from where the glacier is today to where the hut is at its original site. And so you can almost imagine walking through time, because they've also put plaques on the rock buttress. So as you go up, there's plaques that say the glacier was here in 1990 and 1970 and things like that. So I think that really drove it home for me. Like this is real. This is happening in my lifetime. And I want those experiences to be around for my son, for him to enjoy.
Yeah, no, great. Thank you for sharing. And so I know it's been a super successful time for the company over the last, few years. I know you closed your Series B. I think it was 2021, right? The beginning of it, something along those times. Am I right?
We did the final close a year ago, exactly a year ago.
A year ago. So maybe just outline for me a little bit about some of the kind of key progress the company's made, over the last few years.
Sure, absolutely. So going way back, we actually got our start with some really great support from the U.S. government. So we had grant awards from the National Science Foundation, who's been an exceptional partner from day one, from the Department of Energy and the USDA. So that was a great way to get validation and get things kicked off. We raised seed A and now B rounds, and in total that brings our total capital investment, including the grants, to a little over 50 million over the course of our first equity round we closed in January 2018. And so we've taken maybe a little different approach than many others in the space. So we have focused on really demonstrating the technology platform and demonstrating those key proof points in the context of products that have markets that exist. And so I think the most crystal clear way to describe it is, through the completion of our Series A funding. So this goes back to about a year ago. So at that time, we had raised about 15 million or so total, so dilutive and non-dilutive. And through the completion of that series of funding, what we were able to demonstrate was we had our lead product at full commercial scale, so 85,000 liter scale. We had demonstrated the key technology benefits, so the things I mentioned earlier, the predictability across scale, robustness, things like that. And we had, two more products at 3,000 liter scale, so very good demonstration scale. And we had a whole suite of products proving out the versatility and the breadth of the platform and proving out those key technology proof points. So notably the predictability about cross scale, robustness, right? So if you think about what we had accomplished in terms and time and money, so over, call it 2.5, 3 years or so, to have that many proof points and that much activity at scale, and then with customers for those lead products, the team has just done an exceptional job on a comparatively very lean budget, right? If you sort of, I don't know how familiar you are with the field, but obviously others in the field have raised substantially more money at least publicly with much less to show for it. So it really hats off to the team as well as our partners. So we obviously don't have 85,000 liter scale capacity ourselves, so we had to work externally with that. So hats off to our team and as well as the teams that we've worked with to make that a reality. So
yeah, I can imagine over the last couple of years, number one, fermentation capability or capacity, I know is a real challenge, but must have been a real difficult challenge during COVID to not get anywhere, right, and be stuck somewhere for 2 years, right? So
it was extraordinary. Well, and so the interesting thing about that, as another aside, so we did our work at 85,000 liters during the pandemic. So we worked with a partner in Germany. This is public. This is EW Biotech. So we got all the contracts, we got all that sorted out before, but then the pandemic hit, and we actually had to do the work fully remotely. So, we sent them protocols, we sent them strains, we got on lots of Zoom calls, but, we couldn't be there, which is completely anathema to anything that's come before, right? So if you look at the other really great successes in the field, when they did tech transfer to similar scales, they sent a whole team and spent 6 or 8 months on site, right? So we weren't allowed to do that. So, we had to send the strain, send protocol, answer questions, and then rely on both the technology and the teams to get it done. And despite some real world challenges, for example, pH probes failing, or things like that, the very first 2 runs out the door, we hit the target metrics and we reproduced the results that we had seen at scale. So it's a real testament both to technology and to the teams to be able to work in that fully remote capacity. Because again, nothing like that's been demonstrated before either.
So now you can do it remotely. There's no need to go on site for, when you're doing a tech transfer on this size, right?
There are still certainly advantages to being on site, right? Building those relationships and building that trust and the communication. I would imagine it would be a lot less stressful when we're in person. There was an enormous amount of stress on all teams when that was going on. So
no, that's great. And product wise, I mean, is it mainly proteins? I know it's a specific amino acid, in the bio-based amino acid that you produce is your first product, right?
So the first product is an amino acid. So it's an amino acid L-alanine. And the reason we're excited about this, so most people think of amino acid as a nutrition product, which is true. And there are markets in sports and human nutrition, as well as more on the medical grade food side. So more in sort of the pharma realm. But one of the most interesting things to us about this particular amino acid is that it's the critical component for a biodegradable water softener that's found in your detergents today. So any dish or laundry detergent that you have contains this water softening molecule. And the problem that this product has solved, is that it eliminated the phosphates from detergents. So I don't know if you remember in the news a handful of years ago, but that was sort of regulated out because the phosphates pass through wastewater treatment systems. And it's one of the 2 components that lead to eutrophication of waterways. So in the US, that's things like algal blooms, right? So the algae bloom at sort of the mouth of the Mississippi, and that consumes all the oxygen and kills the fish, right? So it's basically phosphorus and nitrogen are the 2 big contributors to that. And then for phosphorus, it was detergents were the single largest contributor of that. So this is one of the problems that solves.
Got it. Okay. So is that, I didn't realize, I'd always thought it was like BCCAs and healthy nutrition. So is that an active market where you're producing this for, as it were?
That is our lead product, and that's where we have confirmed interest from the 2 largest producers of that chelate, of that water softener. So it's a really exciting opportunity for sure.
Yeah, fantastic. And I'm right in thinking that amino acids, they're proteins, right? So is that a platform that produces proteins, or are there other types of molecules that you'll be able to kind of produce with it?
No, so it's a platform technology. So we've used it to make many different types of chemicals. So amino acid is really just one type of chemistry. So organic acids, esters, alcohols, diols, polyols, terpenoids, everything from monoterpene out to carotenoid. So really for anything in the class of small molecules, the technology has worked very, very well. So yeah, that's one of the slides that we show people non-confidentially, right? This sort of list or the schematic of molecules, like here are all the different things, different pathways where we've deployed the technology, and it works really well. So,
yeah, great. No, thank you. So it sounds like there's a lot of opportunity, a lot of different molecules, a lot of different applications. And I suppose, like, where you think, beginning of 2023, what are your, I suppose, your hopes and dreams? Like, both let's start with the company first, in terms of where you can take this, what kind of impact you can genuinely have. And then I'll come back to the broader marketplace maybe afterwards.
Sure. So I think long-term, I think really sort of the sky is the limit, right? So I think we've used the technology to make many different things. We're getting really good customer engagement. We're getting really good interest from partners. And so I think we believe this really could be revolutionary in how industrial biotech is done. So I think, one of the most interesting examples that when I think of sort of aspirational, right? I don't know if you're familiar with the story of sort of the ARM infrastructure for sort of microchips. Have you seen any of this?
Not really, no.
There's a great Wikipedia on it. It's a great historic article. I mean, I'm not a microchip guy, but I found the story fascinating. So it's sort of think of it as a different way to make microchips, where it's essentially less energy dependent, produces less heat. There were a lot of good technology advantages to it. It took quite a long time, right? Some of the initial work was done in the 80s. But if you look today, it's these types of chip architecture are in more than 60% of all mobile devices sold worldwide. And in fact, now Apple has taken them up in their sort of chip manufacturer for their MacBook Airs or MacBook Pros. And you can see it's sort of the ARM M1 or whatever. Anyway, point being, like, I think that's the type of potential, over the long term that we could have, right? If I borrow from another really successful, marketing campaign also in microchips, right? You can envision as sort of the DMC inside, right? I think, again, that I acknowledge that's very aspirational, but you got to dream big.
You got to dream big, right?
So
that's great. No, that's great. And what about the market generally? There's been so many companies over the years from clean tech 1.0 that have not made it, that I get the sense a lot of people have learned a lot of lessons. We're all here today on the back of those lessons.
Yeah.
But are we now, we think about this biotransformation, we think about this climate agenda and net zero, all the things that have stopped us being successful before. Where are we now? And how open a field is it now, to really have impact and to really help on this journey?
Yeah, I think as I sort of reflect on what's different today than when we started OPX back, 2007-ish timeframe, I think a couple of things are really fundamentally different. So there have been a number of really good surveys out that actually queried consumers directly and looked at what's motivating their purchasing choices. And I don't remember the specifics, but the long story short, right, it's consumers are really being motivated by sustainability, right? And so in fact, they're willing to pay more, and they're sort of demanding this from the brands of which they purchase, right? And I think you're starting to see that propagate down the value chain. So if you start from the consumer and go back up to sort of whether it's the brands and then the materials that go into the brands or ingredients that go into the brands, all the way up, it's kind of migrating all the way now into the chemical producers, right? So the folks that make more intermediates. There's actually requirements and demands for them to do better, right? For them to price in sustainability, for them to price in reliability of supply chain, right? And so you're actually, not only are you seeing the brands and the chemical companies starting to make changes, but they're putting real capital at play to make that a reality. And that that really wasn't the case 20 years ago, right? Or 15 years ago. There was a lot of excitement and enthusiasm, but people at that time were largely depending on the mythical green premium that certainly didn't exist. So I think those are some of the big changes. And then, as I mentioned earlier, some of the regulatory changes I think are really foundational to make this a reality, right? So I mentioned the IRA. I mentioned the carbon border adjustment mechanism. And I think the other thing that is working in our favor today, when I think about global macroeconomic trends, for the last 20 years, there's been this optimization or globalization that's focused on how do we squeeze every last penny out of our supply chain. But that only benefited producers, right? It's not like they were selling you stuff that much cheaper, right? But it kept their prices down. All this just-in-time delivery and localizing manufacturing in one geography that turns out is not necessarily a geopolitical ally, right? So we've spent 20 years as a global community optimizing supply chains purely based on lowest possible cost and ignoring every other factor, right? And what the COVID pandemic has illustrated, and also now the events in Ukraine have illustrated, is that, it turns out that our supply chain should not just be the cheapest possible cost. There should be some resiliency in that. And, maybe we don't want to rely on, countries that are not necessarily allies or don't see the world as we do for all the things that we buy and that we need to have a functional society. So you're starting to see this, deglobalization or this shift towards a more regional-based economies. And I think, companies are valuing that now. They're placing a value on their supply chain. And I think industrial biotech is uniquely suited to be a part of that solution. Because if you think about part of the reason why, at least in the chemical space, things were built where they were, is because you need sort of that really high intensity. You need factories the size of medium cities from petroleum, right, to make that happen. And oftentimes, as I learned firsthand, right, some of those processes they work at very high temperature, very high pressure. They're safety hazards, right? It's very real. And that's, people found that cheaper to do in certain geographies than in, say, the US or Europe, right? But the interesting thing about biotech is that if you look at it on a feedstock basis, on a safety basis, and on a customer basis, it all fits very, very well in a regional, more distributed economy, right? So take the US, for example, right? A global leader in farming and agriculture and grain and row crops, right? All of those starches are inputs to fermentation, right? So you can imagine you have a world leader, and it's not just US. Europe is exceptional in this as well, right? You have regional centers of excellence for producing the agricultural inputs. You have the technology to do biochemical fermentation conversion of feedstock into a diversity of different products. And you look at the biggest customer bases, they're in the US and Europe, right? So it's very easy to envision this shift over time to more of a bio-based economy where we're not, solely dependent on, supply chains with no resiliency, redundancy, and we're not solely dependent on, sole sourced out, manufacturing to unfriendly geopolitical regimes. So
yeah, interesting. Thank you for that. Really interesting perspective in terms of what's been happening over the last couple of years. And what about the journey for you? It's been it must have been fascinating, right? In terms of, I suppose, when you started with your partner as a co-founder, and there would have been two of you. How many people work in the company now?
So we've had a significant growth in the last year with the successful close of that financing. So we're at 30 today, which is great. A year ago, we were at 12. So again, hats off to the team who's done incredibly well on a very lean resourcing. So, I would say, for the first 18 months or so, Mike and I did a lot of bootstrapping, a lot of beg, borrow, and steal until we got some of the grants going, and we made it work. And I would say I'm grateful and I'm relieved to now have more help. In particular, we've been able to bring on board some more senior level management, and the team is exceptional. I've managed to bring on board some people that are both excellent in terms of their technical competencies, whether that's finance or engineering or R&D, whatever. They're excellent where where they have their subject matter expertise, and they're genuinely good people. And I think that makes all the difference in the world. So I've got a lot of help now. I can sleep more, marginally more. And I think we're on a really good trajectory in terms of the team. So
oh, great. What have you found the biggest challenges as this is your first gig as a CEO, right? So what's, when you reflect back and think about the journey, what's been the more personal challenges with it?
I mean, I think one of the challenges as a CEO is, you can't get out in front of your skis. So, right, you have a lot of pressures from a lot of different ways. And what we see in the field in particular is that a lot of things get promised. And unfortunately, in our field, there tends to be a lot of under delivery on those promises. I've seen it. I've seen friends and colleagues kind of get there and promise things that I'm kind of left scratching my head, like, is that really possible? It's easy to do, especially in, the venture capital backed worlds. But, you have to strike that balance of, creating a narrative that's really exciting about the opportunity, but also being very clear eyed and setting the right expectations about what's really achievable. Right. And I think, the example that I give, most on this is, the tech world, had great successes in the 2000s, right? In terms of they could scale quickly, right? Because you're just hiring more programmers, right? And launching a product was pretty simple because it's an app most of the time, right? Or it's software. Amazing success in kind of what they were working on. But that philosophy doesn't really translate that well into life sciences, right? You can't put more scientists in a room and necessarily go faster, right? Maybe you can, but knowing which problems would benefit from throwing more resources at them and which ones won't, I think is a critical learning for life sciences.
Yeah, absolutely. Tell me, just out of that point, because it's the nature of a venture-backed business, right? Small, creating the dream and vision, selling it to investors, bringing them on. But the hype around the sector over the last few years and the valuations and, the rush to go public. We're here now, beginning of 2023. A couple of years ago, everyone, we want an IPO, and it's the poison chalice, isn't it? I mean, it just doesn't work, does it? When you're an innovating, technology-orientated, biology-focused company. It's just, has anything worked well from that viewpoint? Do you think?
I would say, getting to a public company, it can provide access to different types of capital. But I can only really think of maybe one or two examples of where that's really panned out. I think one of the colleagues I was speaking to not that long ago summed it up very, very well, right? The private markets, venture capital in particular, and to a lesser extent, private equity, the private markets tend to be much more forgiving, right? Than the public markets. And I think some of our colleagues, in the field have learned that firsthand, right? So they got an exit, they got public, and then, missing public milestones, the public markets can be absolutely brutal, right? So massive price corrections, valuation corrections. I think you're absolutely right. It's a two-edged sword.
Yeah.
I think if you really have good fundamentals and you have a credible plan, that's, well thought out and well planned, I think it can be a great way to go. But I think you're right. I think there was sort of a rush to that, certainly with the SPACs, right? It made it sort of easier, if you will. But as we've seen, the SPAC market has not done well either, and that's firmly closed. So yeah, it's a challenge, right? It's a challenge to be successful with all of that. I think one of the greatest pieces of advice that I was given when we were initially raising was, to be very, very mindful of valuation, right? And this was, part of this was driven, so our first investor was Capricorn Ventures, Capricorn Partners, based out of Belgium, so European. And I think I didn't really appreciate it at the time, but now I appreciate it more than ever. There was, and there still is, a very different vibe and feel. So US based companies and VCs tended to go to sky high valuations very, very, very quickly, right? And in Europe, we found that to be much more moderating. And the advice I was given was, look, don't be too stuck on high valuations, especially early on. Because at least statistically, for any field, but certainly in life sciences, in biotechs and bio, right? Chances are at some point, something's going to go sideways and you're probably going to have to do a down round. And, if you go too high, too fast, right? You limit the number of potential investors subsequently because they just won't invest at that price. And B, if things go sideways and you have to do a down round, it essentially wipes out the founders, right? So you got to think the long game and have, yes, it means giving up a little bit of control earlier, or more control than many people would like. But in the event something goes sideways, right, you're in a much better position to sort of recover and not be wiped out as a founder or an early investor. And I think, unfortunately, I have a lot of colleagues where that's going to come to fruition in the next year, right? So I feel very grateful and fortunate that we got our round closed when we did. Obviously, the economy has dramatically shifted. And word on the street is it's gotten much, much harder to raise capital, and valuations have taken a significant impact. So
yeah, absolutely. Definitely good to have had it done, had your B round done a year ago, as it were, as opposed to going in this year looking for a B round, that's for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
But no, that's fantastic. Listen, really appreciated your insights. So thanks so much for coming on the show and sharing all that you've shared, and wanted to wish you and DMC all the very best for this year and beyond.
Great. Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate the time together. This was fun. Let's do it again.